Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Angela Greiling-Keene. I'm a reporter for Bloomberg News and I'm the 106th president of the National Press Club. We are the world's leading professional organization for journalists, committed to our profession's future through programming with events such as this, while fostering a free press worldwide. For more information about the National Press Club, please visit our website at www.press.org. To donate to programs offered to the public through the National Press Club Journalism Institute, please visit www.press.org/institute. On behalf of our members worldwide, I'd like to welcome our speaker and those of you in the audience at today's event. Our head table includes guests of our speaker as well as working journalists who are club members. If you hear applause from the audience, we'd note that members of the general public are also attending, so it's not necessarily evidence of a lack of journalistic objectivity. I'd also like to welcome our C-SPAN and public radio audiences. Our luncheons are featured on our member-produced weekly podcast from the National Press Club, which is available on iTunes. You can follow the action today on Twitter using the hashtag NPCLunch. After our guest speech concludes, we'll have a question and answer session. I will ask as many questions as time permits. Now it's time to introduce our head table guests. I'd ask each of you to stand up briefly as your name is announced. From your right, Jamila Bey, the host of Sex, Politics, and Religion Hour on Voice of Russia Radio. Margaret McKenzie, the ASHA Information Officer. Eddie Brown, the chairman, CEO, and founder of Brown Capital Management. Nikki Schwab, Yeas and Nays columnist for the Washington Examiner. April Ryan, White House correspondent for American Urban Radio Network. Traci Odie Blunt, the senior vice president for corporate communication and public affairs for the RLJ companies. Skipping over the podium, Donna Lindwan-Leger, reporter for USA Today, the former president of the National Press Club and the Speakers Committee chair this year. Skipping over the speaker for a moment, Nairi Wright, senior vice president with the MSL Group and the Speakers Committee member who organized today's event. Thank you for that, Nairi. Ty Brown, who is a guest speaker. Jeff Ballou, deputy news editor with Al Jazeera Media Network and a member of the National Press Club Board of Governors. Askia Muhammad, the news director for WPFW-FM, and John Doyle, CEO of the Principal Network. Our guest today became the first black billionaire in the United States, the first African American to list a company on the New York Stock Exchange, and the first black majority owner of a professional sports team. Robert Johnson founded Black Entertainment Television, which he sold as BET Holdings Incorporated to Viacom in 2001 for about $3 billion. Mr. Johnson has made his fortune targeting a black urban audience, first at BET, the nation's first television network to provide entertainment, music, news, sports, and public affairs programming for an African American audience. After its 1980 debut, the company went public in 1991, with BET channels now reaching about 90% of all black households with cable. He sold BET to Viacom after taking it private, again, 7 years after its IPO. It's now part of the Viacom empire, which also includes Comedy Central, MTV, Nickelodeon, Spike, and much more. Mr. Johnson shook off critics over the years, including director Spike Lee, who complained that BET programming included too much sex and violence, by pointing out that the E in the network's name stands for entertainment. Mr. Johnson is the former majority owner of the expansion NBA franchise, the Charlotte Bobcats. He sold his stake to NBA legend Michael Jordan 3 years ago. In his post-BET career, he's raising money as chairman of RLJ companies and investing in businesses in and out of media and entertainment. RLJ's portfolio is too long to list here in an introduction, but it includes real estate, private equity, car dealerships, and the video lottery industry. A year ago, RLJ announced it was acquiring 2 content companies, Image Entertainment and Acorn Media Group, to create an online distributor of digital video content. In February, the company launched the opsplace.com website to match minority job seekers with employers and minority business owners with applicants. Mr. Johnson said a chief reason he created the site was to reduce the disparity in unemployment for minority Americans. Mr. Johnson, a father of two, is known for his 15-hour workdays and 6-day work weeks. He's a native of Hickory, Mississippi, and grew up along with his 9 siblings in Freeport, Illinois. His early work included delivering newspapers, but he's since said it was something that required him to get up way too early to do. After college at the University of Illinois and grad school at Princeton University, he found his way to Washington and to a series of jobs, including as a lobbyist at what was then called the National Cable Television Association. That's what sparked his interest in creating his own cable network. Mr. Johnson is here today to announce the findings from a Zogby poll he commissioned on Black opinions in the age of Obama. Zogby Analytics surveyed about 1,000 African-American adults online and by telephone to gauge the community's sentiments on politics, the economy, and social mores. Please help me give a warm National Press Club welcome to Robert Johnson.
Thanks, Angela, and good afternoon, everybody, and I'm delighted to be here. I was sitting here talking to Donna, and she said, you know you arrived when your face is on a cookie. So I'm glad it's her. And April Ryan told me she's going to tweet it. She already did. I also like to recognize Allison Fitzgerald, the chairwoman of the Speakers Committee, and also Nairi Wright, the speakers, who put this speaking event together for me, so thank you very much. So again, Angela, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you members of the Press Club and invited guests for being here this afternoon to hear the results of a national poll that I commissioned last month. The poll was conducted by Zogby Analytics. As many of you know, John Zogby has conducted and produced polls for over 30 years, and is well respected for his record of accuracy, credibility, and reliability. The poll was conducted by a telephone and online survey with a random sample of 1,002 African American adults across the country to gauge their opinion on current social, economic, and political issues directly affecting the African American community. As most of you know, I have always been vocal about economic opportunity for African Americans. As the founder of BET and now the RLJ companies, which, as Angela pointed out, includes investments in RLJ Lodging Trust, a publicly traded $2.5 billion hotel REIT with over 147 hotels, some 20,000 rooms across the country, where I serve as executive chairman. RLJ McClarity, the largest minority-owned automobile dealership group in the country with over $1 billion in sales. RLJ Private Equity, a private equity firm in partnership with the Carlyle Group, and RLJ Entertainment, the largest independent distributor of entertainment content, which is traded on the NASDAQ. I am what you might call a serial entrepreneur. I get a vision about something that should be done, usually in an area where African Americans are economically underrepresented, and I try my best to create a business solution to help address these social and economic problems. For example, as Angela pointed out a year ago, the RLJ companies launched OpsPlace, an online job and business site specifically designed to introduce minority individuals and minority-owned businesses to large U.S. companies to encourage employment and business opportunities. The businesses I've started, in addition to creating a value for my investors and shareholders, have the important goal of empowering African Americans who have the ability to create value and wealth for themselves and ultimately this nation. Make no mistake, there are millions of African American men and women who have the talent, the ingenuity, and the work ethic to fulfill these goals. I think you would also agree with me that this nation has created the greatest society for individual economic opportunity and achievement that mankind has ever seen. But despite that fact, there is the troubling question that has to be asked, and that is, to what extent do African Americans fully participate in this equation? My primary concern is why, after enacting and enforcing needed civil and equal rights laws, spending more money on education for African American students at all levels than at any other time in the history of this nation, and having twice elected an African American president, Black American families are still experiencing a growing disparity in employment, access to capital, wealth accumulation, and as a direct consequence, stagnation in economic opportunity and quality of life. In an attempt to answer these questions, I commissioned a poll with the following political and economic developments in mind. Number one, for Black Americans, this country has experienced the most historical political event, in my opinion at least, since the enactment of the Emancipation Proclamation. That event is, of course, the election and re-election of the first African American president, Barack Obama. Because of this monumental occurrence for all Americans, but particularly African Americans, I wanted to find out how African Americans today feel about Obama's presidency, and equally important, if they feel that their lives are better off having lived under the first 4 years of Obama and the prospect of an Obama administration for the next 4 years. Number two, this nation is engaged in a major debate about the role of government in providing for the economic well-being of working class and middle class Americans. Without question, most African American families fall within that category. The debate raises the question of how much entitlement security the government should make available to these citizens and who should bear the cost of such transfer payments. The issue being raised is whether this country's economic future is at risk because of the rising cost of entitlements and the debt and deficit that follows. This dispute, no matter how it is resolved, will directly impact African American families more so than any other population. This country has recently experienced the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. We have seen a decline in economic growth and opportunity for all Americans, but African Americans have been the hardest hit. This has been true in the past, and it is true today, as the most recent economic data clearly drives home that fact. Here are the facts. African Americans have double the rate of unemployment as white Americans. The national average is 7.7%, and African American employment is 13.8%. To be honest, it's probably greater than that when you count the number of African Americans who have simply given up on finding an employment. Sadly, this is not a new fact. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, African American unemployment has been double that of whites for over 50 years. The income gap of white Americans is 10 times that of Black Americans. The net worth of the median white household is $118,000, and the net worth of the median Black household is $11,800. The wealth gap between Black Americans and white Americans over the past 20 years has increased from $20,000 to $90,000, according to the Pew Research Center. And again, according to the Pew Research Center, nearly half of African Americans born to middle-class families in the 60s will never attain the wealth of their parents. Number three, African Americans were once the largest ethnic minority group and the dominant minority political voice in this country dating back to the Civil Rights Movement. African Americans are now confronted with the growing influence of the Hispanic population, which is today the largest minority population group. I wanted to gauge African American sentiment about the political and economic changes that could result from Hispanic Americans being the largest minority. This demographic fact could lead to Hispanics potentially exercising greater political influence within the country on key issues of importance to African Americans, namely competition for jobs and minority business opportunities, and perhaps even Hispanics becoming the dominant ethnic voice on cultural and social issues. Number 4, I also wanted to find out how African Americans feel about their political leaders and organizations that represent their interests, as well as assess the attitudes about key and social cultural issues of the moment. For example, immigration reform, marriage equality, the gun and assault weapons ban, and the 2016 presidential election. And finally, number 5, I didn't know of any other organization that had recently conducted a poll targeted to African Americans with this combination of social, economic, and political question. So, as an entrepreneur, I decided to do it. I wanted to create a discussion within the Black community and the broader community to bring to the forefront of public debate key issues of primary concern to African Americans. I'm pleased to say that I'm intrigued by the results of the poll, and I believe better informed, and I hope you will be also. Now, despite all of the political and economic realities confronting Black America, which I just outlined, what truly intrigued me about the poll is that the poll results point to a Black America firmly believing that their lives are a glass half filled rather than a glass half empty. So what did the poll, which I've chosen to entitle Black Opinions in the Age of Obama, reveal? African Americans have an immense sense of pride in Barack Obama as President of the United States, and he is unequivocally liked. He receives a 91% favorability rating. 72% believe that President Obama's election has helped them, while only 4% believe his election has hurt them. Consistent with the data that shows that African Americans believe that President Obama's election has helped them, a majority of those polled, 62%, are optimistic about employment in the next 4 years. 30% of respondents say they are doing better off financially than they were 4 years ago. About half say they're at least doing the same. And 25% say that African Americans in general are doing better, while 44% say they're doing about the same, and 21% say they are worse off. On race relations, tied to this feeling that Obama's presidency has been positive for African Americans, 53% of African Americans say that white African American relations will improve, while only 23% are pessimistic. When asked why they believe Black unemployment rate was double that of whites, responses include failure of the education system for African Americans, 50%. Lack of corporate commitment to hiring minorities and African Americans, 48%. Lack of good government policies, 25%. As to whether respondents felt they were overlooked or discounted as a serious candidate for employment because of their race, 47% said yes, and 39% said no. When asked why the wealth gap has increased by 70,000 over the last 20 years, nearly half, 47% of respondents, say that both lack of jobs and lack of access to capital are the blame for the wealth gap between Black and white Americans. Now, since I agree that unemployment and access to capital are the most pressing issues for African Americans, I also asked the poll about something I've been promoting for the last few years, what I've called the RLJ rule. 2 years ago at this press club, I spoke about the RLJ rule, which is adapted from the National Football League's NFL Rooney Rule. In 2003, the NFL established the Rooney Rule, which mandated, subject to a league fine, that the 32 team owners must give fair interviews to qualified minority candidates whenever a head coaching or a general manager position became available before making a new hire. The RLJ rule, unlike the Rooney Rule, is proposed as a voluntary rule and designed to encourage companies to establish best practice policies to identify and interview at least 2 African Americans at the managerial level before filling a position, and to interview qualified black businesses prior to awarding a small business procurement contract. We included a description of the RLJ rule in the poll and found that 75% of those polled were either very or somewhat supportive. 47% of respondents said it would help African Americans' chances to be hired or to become a minority supplier. And 53% said they would like to see the RLJ rule enacted into law. With these critical issues facing the African American community, the poll also asked who was a person or organization that would be the voice for African Americans to ensure that their voice was heard at the national level. The leading civil rights and economic empowerment organizations scored very well. The NAACP received an 83% favorable rating. The National Urban League received a 69% favorable rating, and the Congressional Black Caucus received a 68% rating. When respondents were asked for the name of individuals who best represent their interests, an overwhelming 40% said no one speaks for them. A segment of the poll focused on issues related to the emergence of the Hispanic population, race relations, guns, gay rights, and the 2016 presidential election. On Hispanics, African Americans, 63% of African Americans favor a path to full citizenship within 10 years for Hispanics who are here illegally, while only 16% say they should never achieve full citizenship. Interestingly enough, 51% of African Americans believe that Hispanics will achieve greater economic growth than African Americans over the next 5 years. 39% of 18 to 29-year-olds share this feeling, and 60% of those 50 years or older. Some of the reasons for this include Hispanics face less racism than African Americans, Hispanic lifestyle and work ethic. Hispanics are given more opportunity, education is better. On guns, 67% of African Americans favor a ban on assault weapons, while 20% oppose such a ban. This includes a majority of all age groups. Expressing a deep concern about reaction to gun crime in the black community, 75% of African Americans believe that the nation pays less attention to black-on-black gun crime than on gun crime against whites. On gay rights, African Americans are evenly split on the issue of same-sex marriage. 42% feel that marriage is exclusively defined as between a man and a woman, while 40% would support gay marriages having the same rights as heterosexual couples. We also asked a question about ministers who oppose homosexuality and gay marriage. The results also were evenly split. 1 in 3, 34% support the ministers. 1 in 3, approximately 31%, say the ministers are wrong, and 1 in 3, 35% have no opinion. On the 2016 presidential race, we asked the question, if the Democratic primary for president were held today, for whom would you vote, and who should President Obama endorse to succeed him as the next president of the United States? Out of 6 potential Democratic candidates, nearly half of the respondents, 46%, say that they would support Hillary Clinton for President of the United States if the Democratic primary were held today. About 1 in 5 would support Vice President Biden. In conclusion, the Zogby poll clearly demonstrates for African Americans, having an African American president elected to 2 terms has created a tremendous sense and feeling of unparalleled political pride. Because of this feeling, and despite all of the economic challenges before us, I believe that African Americans are uniquely hopeful about their future. Interestingly enough as well, this emotion and belief was expressed by President Obama during his recent speech to the people of Israel. Speaking about the African American experience, the president said, "To African Americans, the story of the Exodus told a powerful tale about emerging from the grip of bondage to reach for liberty and human dignity. A tale that was carried from slavery through the civil rights movement. For generations, this promise helped people weather poverty and persecution while holding on to the hope that a better day was on the horizon." I completely agree with the president. However, my concern, and maybe even fear, is that if this faith-like hope, or promise of a better day on the horizon is not rewarded with real and measurable economic change during and after the Obama presidency, the failure to do so, and it would be regrettable for African Americans and regrettable for the nation, result in a major shift from hope to despair for millions of African Americans who today look at this nation in the age of Obama and say, our glasses half filled and we are still hopeful. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and I'll be glad to take questions.
Thank you. You get to stay.
Stick on sneaker.
One can presume that the poll was conducted for more than just the sake of insight. When you commissioned the survey, did you have a specific plan of action that was to be informed by the survey results? And whatever that might be, even if it wasn't a plan ahead of time, can you tell us what you plan to do now that you had the results?
No, as I said earlier, I've always been vocal on this issue of African American empowerment and the need for African Americans to share in the creation of the wealth of this nation. And I've always been perplexed as to why we always have this gap, this disparity. And I figure with some of the changes, the currents that are rushing towards us, and ranging from obviously the president election, as I said, the growth of the Hispanic population, the debate on deficit and budget and entitlement, and everybody else asserting their rights, somebody needs to start talking about this. So I want to talk about it. I put it out. I've got a good press person in Traci, and she's got it out all over the land. And I hope people will start talking about it. So at the end of the day, my goal was to provide fodder for discussion with the hope that somehow it'll steer us in the right direction, both as a people and as a country.
Of the results that you just told us about, what parts were most surprising for you? And if there weren't surprises, were there particular parts that should be cause for alarm, in your opinion?
There weren't any real surprises. I always, African American on the issue of gay rights, African Americans are far more conservative on that issue than I think the general population. So that wasn't surprised. I was surprised probably by the one that African Americans believe that Hispanics will possibly outpace them economically over the next 5 years. I didn't expect to see that. And then I was a little bit surprised on which was gratified though, on the fact that they were big supporters of immigration reform. We had another question that we didn't put in the poll, we didn't put in the speech. Did African Americans believe that gay rights are the same as equal rights for African Americans? And surprisingly, they shared the view that the gays can make the argument that their rights are tantamount to African American equal or civil rights. So that was it. But I think the whole mix of it is the thing that, like I said, most compelling was just the undoubtable faith that African Americans as a people have in that there's a better life coming and that things will get better. And that to me is it's a wonderful thing to think about. My concern is at what point does it shift, or if it ever shifts, and if it doesn't shift, what does it mean? Do you just get along to go along?
Can you tell us a little bit about the nuts and bolts of the poll? You tell us it was 1,002 adults that were surveyed. When was it done? What was the margin of error? And is there a website on which we can find the full results?
Yeah, the poll will be available. Tracy, where?
RLJ Company's website.
It'll be on the RLJ Company's website. It was done by Zogby. It was done. We hoped to release it in February, Black History Month, but we lost out on that. We didn't get it done in time. But it was done. Obviously, Zogby has great credibility for the analytics. So within a margin of error that's traditional in polls like this, it truly represents the feeling of 32 million or 33 million African Americans. So we're comfortable that we got it right in terms of their opinion. And all the data will be available for anybody who wants to look at it. And we did it telephonic and online because we recognized the shift in online access and online use. If you go telephonic, you tend to get an older skew. If you go online, you get a younger skew. So we came up with a measurement that allowed us to weight it one way or the other. So we feel we got a very good representative sample of how to reach people.
What was your take on the survey respondents, 40% of them answering that no one speaks for them?
Well, I think it's that, and I think the crowd will understand this, African Americans like to be their own boss, and, they don't want anybody to tell them what to think or what to do. And then, of course, what's the old thing, proximity breeds contempt. I think a lot of times, we get associated with these leaders and we see them up close, we see their flaws and we see their foibles, and we say, yeah, we like them today, we don't like them tomorrow, and so that kind of thing. Because when the numbers came up, no one was really, if we thought one of the, and we had a list of 10 or 12 names of what I'd call the usual suspects. Nobody jumped up high enough for us to say, this person, this man, this woman is a leader. And so the 40% was significantly higher than anybody who got a designation as, quote, they speak for me.
A couple more nuts and bolts questions. One person wants to know about the economic and educational demographics of the respondents. Another asked about the geographic distribution around the country.
On the education, I think you have to look in the internals, and they're in the poll, so I'd have to pass on that, and you have to sort of dig that one out yourself. And I think on the demographics, we made sure this represented the entire United States. So we made sure we got East Coast, West Coast, North, South. So it was clearly representative of African Americans. Obviously, since probably 65% or more African Americans live east of the Mississippi, you could probably say it has an East Coast, South, East Coast kind of skew, and less in Alaska. But that's sort of the facts.
You said you want to spark discussion, and you're here at the National Press Club doing that. Bill Cosby, of course, famously sparked discussion a couple years ago and faced a fair amount of criticism when he did that. How are you going about that differently, or do you not mind having criticism if that's what comes?
I'm used to having criticism, believe me. To me, I'm not looking for a he said, she said kind of thing. What I'm really looking for, and I'll tell you, that's why when I wrote that speech, I said I could have stuck with concern and said my concern is, which is a lighter version of fear. You go from concern to deep concern to fear. I am literally troubled by the fact that, and if you ever go to the Pew Research Center and ask for some of their data on African American decline in opportunity, it would really scare you. And when you think of the amount of savings that people don't have who plan to retire, when you think of all the medical expenses that could front a family, from everything from Alzheimer's to other kinds of medical diseases that could befall a family, you think about potential cuts in the social safety net, and you think about the fact that jobs are facing not only competition here in the United States, but globally. You have to ask yourself the question, how are African Americans going to make that transition with all these headwinds against us if somebody doesn't focus on this need to put African Americans and other minorities, for that matter, Hispanics as well, to work in this country? Because you can do a whole lot of things in China, you can do a whole lot of things in Vietnam, you can do a whole lot of things in Brazil and sub-Saharan Africa, and you can do them cheaper. And so at some point, we've got to address that problem, or else we are going to be, like the Pew Research said, at a position where children who are born today will not attain the wealth of their parents. And you know that creates an effect of a continual downgrade of economic well-being. And it literally troubles me that we will be happy for 50 years with 50% unemployment. This country would never tolerate white unemployment at 14 or 15%. No one would ever stay in office at 14 or 15% unemployment in this nation. But we've had that double unemployment for over 50 years. And to me, that's what I'm looking for, is somebody to say, why has this happened for 50 years when all the things that we've done, and we've done it with, in my opinion, with dignity and hope. And if that doesn't change, somebody's going to have to pay. 34 million African Americans are not going to leave this country. 34 million African Americans who don't, millions of African Americans who don't have jobs, somebody's going to have to pay for them. Somebody's going to have to take care of them. And if somebody has to take care of them, that money's got to come from somebody. And whoever's paying for it is going to be upset about it. And they're going to start looking for somebody to blame. You know, we can't be competitive if we don't put all our people on the field to work. And African Americans can't be consumers if they don't have jobs. They can't buy housing. The reason the wealth gap is so high, we don't own home ownership. We don't have savings. We don't have investments. And part of that is because we don't have capital. So a white household can buy a home. Now it's even more difficult to buy a home. There's talk about taking the home deduction away as part of a chance to balance the budget. So all of these things, as I said, however the solution comes out, it's going to impact us. If they borrow more debt, interest rates are going to go up. If they pay more entitlements, somebody's going to be upset about it. They're going to cut other programs to pay for them. So we really need to focus on our well-being in a unique way and come up with solutions that are unique to us, because every other interest group in this nation is doing that. We are way behind the curve in being vocal about our interest group compared to gay Americans. You've seen the resurgence of Hispanic Americans at the Democratic caucus. You've seen the courting going on for Hispanic Americans by the Republicans and the Democrats. And think of this. The swing states are states where Hispanic Americans are dominant. So if you want to get those votes and you're in a party, Republican or Democrat, you're not going to court the black folks living in Trenton. You're going to court the Hispanics living in Nevada, the Hispanics living in Florida, the Hispanics living in other states, Colorado. That's a fact of life. Nothing against Hispanics. It's not going to go away. They deserve their day in the sun, and they should go for it. But we must protect our interests in a very active way to make sure that our voices are not lost in this grab by interest groups for their particular voice.
When we look at the lack of capital and wealth in the hands of black families, how should the black American consumer respond? Is it an issue of self-determination or a larger national policy issue?
You know, I think it's a larger national policy issue. We have had, I remember back in the day, Reverend Jackson would lead sort of consumer boycotts, you know, and he would go in and you know, take on a company and tell black folks don't buy that stuff because they don't do business with minority businesses and so forth. And usually one or two guys would get a contract and it'll be over. It really didn't solve a problem. What you really got to do is you got to put more capital in the hands of African-American entrepreneurs and businesses. And I know they're out there because a lot of them work for me and I meet a lot of them. It's got to be a national policy. Some of these solutions, and I hesitate to say it, but some of these solutions have to have a pivot towards race solutions. You know, right now, affirmative action at the college level is under assault. Now, that raises a question if it's there. it's already under assault on minority procurement and everything else, where as Sandra Day O'Connor ruled in the Adirondack case, I think, that said before you can have any kind of set-aside program for a minority company to get a benefit of a contract over a white contractor, there must be a compelling national interest. Well, I think there's a compelling national interest when there's a 90% wealth gap, when there's a 10% income gap, when there's a decline in income to this degree, that somehow you got to come up with specific kinds of things. And that's why I brought up the RLJ rule. It's not a law. It's not a threat to fine. It's just adopted as good business practice and use the bully pulpit to ask companies to do it. I mean, if a company's getting billions of dollars from the government, what's wrong with the government saying, hey, you get a lot of money from me for building this or that? You know, adopt this rule as a voluntary thing. And what's wrong with companies, you know, just embracing it as a day? And nobody's asking anybody to force a minority to a job or ask for a quota. Just interview them. Give them a chance. Maybe they don't qualify for that job, they qualify for another job. So those are this has got to be a national position. You can't just say, let's boycott, you know, a company A and make them turn around. That's not going to work because the messaging of it is wrong, and it's, you know, and it doesn't solve the problem for everybody as a whole. We just got to figure out a way. You know, I talked to, I really did this. I talked to the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee a year or so back about all this money that's sitting on the sidelines in foreign banks and everything that companies don't want to bring back to the country because it's going to be heavily taxed. I propose that, well, look, why don't you do this? Go to the companies and say, look, you can bring the capital back into the country. And what we'd like you to do is set up a multi-billion-dollar fund to put money behind minority entrepreneurs. And we'll find the people to run the money and so forth. And if you do that, we will either eliminate your tax or reduce your tax dramatically. Because you think about it, if they take their money, they bring it back, taxes cut in half, they then take the money to give it to smart entrepreneurs like out in this room, they make money that way as well. So it's not like they're losing any money. They're just taking a bet on a different set of people. But right now you got trillions of dollars sitting in foreign banks and foreign companies' treasury because they don't want to bring it back to the United States. And you know, the question say, well, how do you do that where you can't target minorities with this because you can't use tax policy to aid one group over another group and everybody will scream, this is something just special for African Americans. Well, you know, we have been special ever since we've been here. And, you know, it started with the Declaration of Independence. It went all the way to a war and civil rights and everything. At some point, you got to say, you got to go back to special. And if you can come up with ways to do it to make it palatable to people because it's based on some sort of economic model, then you got to do it. Otherwise, I can tell you folks, otherwise, in my opinion, not very much will change. There's nothing on the horizon that I see that's changing the economic opportunity growth for African Americans in this country. I can't let, I mean, the 62% said that they believe that they will get jobs in the next 4 years. Do you realize what the employment rate would have to drop to employ 60% of African Americans who are currently underemployed? Have to drop to 2. And then we'd be at 4. There's no way that this country in the next 2 to 3 years can get to a 2% unemployment. And so, to me, that's the issue. It has to, we have to engage the Sandra Day O'Connor argument that she said that, you know, one day, 25 years from now, we'll never have to have these race kind of issues because everybody will be happy and nobody will be treated differently. I don't see it coming. In fact, I see it going the other way.
Should African Americans stick with the Democratic Party if the community's interests are being ignored? Questioner asked, do you think African Americans' interests can get more attention if they considered throwing their support elsewhere? And I would add that just last week we had RNC Chairman Reince Priebus standing right where you're standing now, saying that he wanted to get more votes from all minority communities.
Well, he's standing on the right, I'll get to the left. Let me see. Let me say this. Here's the thing. Here's the thing. It's, you know, it's a little bit too late for that gambit. You know, you can't do it because you know, the old saying used to be, Republicans ignore us, Democrats take us for granted. I think that's pretty much locked in stone. You're not going to get much because it's just pure brazen bare knuckle politics. You do not, you may need it in the primaries to get there, to get elected, but in the general election, the Electoral College is really controlled by the swing states, and that's not where we are. So we don't have that kind of leverage to do that. You know, I've often talked to the Congressional Black Caucus, and this is an idea I had. I said, you guys should think more like the Israeli Knesset and just shift back and forth from party to party on key vote issues. Don't, you know, just don't have anything. But you know, that could change some things. You know, you got 48, I don't know, maybe 46, 7, I don't know, members over there. You know, if some big issue came up and they decide, I mean, most of them are in safe districts, I believe. So if they just said, hey, look at what we're going to do. We're going to go over one day and cut a deal with Boehner, and the next day we'll cut a deal with Pelosi, and then we'll go to black folks and explain it, so don't always reelect us, so we can always come back and swing this way and swing that way. You might be able to shake up things a little bit that way, but it would have to be, they think of themselves in a parliamentary system as opposed to locked into a party. But I don't think you can, I mean, it'd be really hard to sort of motivate the people of this country to sort of say, okay, now ignore the Democratic Party. I mean, where would you go? You can't form an independent party. The Republican Party is not going to, you know, much as they mouth at it, can't do it. And of course, you got what, you know, 36 million Hispanics, and, you know, growing at a faster rate than the whole country as a whole. You know, what's your leverage? And so I think it's sort of, you got to push within your own community to sort of build your own sense of who you are, and make everything you do at the local, national, and every other level focus on your issues. I mean, I mean, there are communities who've done this. I think the gay and lesbian community has done a terrific job in representing their interests. And just focus everybody on it, and never let anybody get away from the notion that they deserve, want to be treated equally in every aspect. And it's working. And if anything, we should borrow a page from what they're doing. And like I said, they vote on core issues related to their best interests. And we need to adopt some of that strategy. But other than that, I don't see any trying to jump out of one party into another party. I don't think that's viable.
What's your opinion about Dr. Benjamin Carson's recent comments and his criticism of the Obama administration's, as well as his newfound appeal to some conservative quarters as a potential foil in the next presidential election?
I think it's sort of a flavor of the month kind of thing. I know Ben real well. He's a really brilliant surgeon, and he's entitled to his own opinion. But I don't think he has any interest at all in trying to project himself as a national spokesperson. I think there's that just thing that it's going to go around for a while of somebody, whoever, you know, this is sort of like a man bites dog kind of thing, you know, where, you know, if anybody says something and they just happen to be black, and I know this, that's critical of Obama, boy, that's a news story. So I'm not trying to make a news story. So, you know, and so I think what Ben did, he fell into that man bites dog thing. And that's what happened. And, you know, a year from now, 2 years from now, he'll be doing what he does as a great surgeon, and nobody will be thinking of him, you know, being, you know, running for president or being a voice and things. He's just a great guy who has an opinion, and, you know, people are looking for maybe a slow news day, and they grabbed it, you know.
Speaking of news, you're here speaking at the National Press Club in a room filled with journalists. Our industry is, well, reportedly in decline, and African Americans lead in terms of percentage leaving the industry, as well as losing positions in newsrooms. What do you say, as a serial entrepreneur, that should be done so that black American journalists do not go the way of the Pullman Porter?
Pullman Porter. That's good. That's a good analogy. You know, its problem is that you're sort of in an industry that's changing. And it's changing in terms of being, requiring less heavy reporting, less costly reporting, more technology-driven, more media-driven. And so, newspapers are facing that challenge. And when companies see themselves facing a decline in revenue or decline in market share, they start cutting. And they start cutting where they can to, maximize their business. And unfortunately, if you're sort of, not an essential or lower on the totem pole or the last hired, you're going to be the first fired. And that's what's happening. And it's playing out in corporations as well. I think what the corollary to that is I've seen a rise in black bloggers and using the internet as a way to sort of get your voice heard and maybe build a business model. And I would encourage those of you who have the skills as journalists and a business mind to boot, I would urge you to go seek an opportunity to be a part of one of the growing, emerging news sites or other social network sites and ply your trade there and build a business around that. Keep in mind, at one point, 3 of the largest companies in the country were black magazines targeted only to black people. Ebony, Jet, and Essence, and I guess Black Enterprise. So it's not impossible to create a business model basically going after the 12, 13 million African-American households who spend a lot of money and who are still major cultural drivers in this country. So I wouldn't fret too much about the decline of a business that is, that you can't reverse. I would try to say, get off the ship at the right time and focus on what you can do on your own.
Questioner asks, would the election of a Hispanic president in 2016 represent a setback for African Americans? Why or why not?
Obviously it would depend on who it is. I imagine if African Americans had an election of a Republican Hispanic, that their natural instinct would be say that's bad, probably because he's a Republican more than he's a Hispanic. If he were a Democrat, they might say, do you think we have a voice? Can we get to him? And things like that. But I can tell you this: coming after Obama, any election of anybody is going to be a feeling of a setback for African Americans. You're never going to see this high a return. And so you got to add that to the equation. But the thing that I'm most concerned about, which I think, again, is something that I wanted to create as a discussion point, I don't know when the last time there's been a major confab between the dominant black organizations and the dominant Hispanic organizations. If you really think about it, we ought to be meeting black and Hispanics every day to let the other side figure out what we're talking about. And we are sort of staying away from each other and not sort of embracing each other. I mean, I've been in business, believe me, I've been in business 30 years. I defy anybody to name me the last time an African-American business and a Hispanic business merged together to go in and bid for a contract. I don't know any business that I know of, and I know a lot of minority businesses that. The other thing is, I don't know how much social interaction take place between blacks and Hispanics. Part of it is geography. Some of it may be language. Part of it may be cultural, and some of it may be income, because their incomes are still probably below ours on a national basis. But that's changing. I mean, you look around and you think about, when I first came to Washington, I walk into a parking lot, I tell you, 60% of the guys were black, 30% were white. There are almost no Hispanics. You walk into a parking lot in D.C. today, when I first got here in Washington, the guy who did my lawn was an African-American guy. He retired, next group came in, they were Hispanics. And so, right now, these things are changing. The daughter of my Hispanic housekeeper who came from El Salvador and finally got her citizenship, she's working at NIT going on her doctorate program. And so, I mean, NIH going on our doctorate program. So the point I'm trying to make is, this is a resurgent population with their goals in life to build strong families and to build wealth for themselves. And they're not going to sit back and say, oh, we're going to do it and take into account African Americans. What they've got to do and what we've got to do is figure out where we have common cause. I mean, again, back to the gay community made it a common cause that we are aligned with African Americans. What you went through, we're going through. We need to go to the Hispanics and say, what you're facing coming to this country, we've had some experience doing. We need to get together. The Congressional Black Caucus and the Hispanic Caucus ought to start meeting every week to figure out what programs they can implement. Now, if you want to talk about a voting block for now and probably the next 20 years, that's a voting block.
One question about your business. You've said that you might take RLJ companies public. Do you have any plan to do so? And if so, what would be the impetus that would make you do that?
No, we don't have any plans. RLJ Companies is a holding company. We got 2 companies that are already public, and believe me, that's enough. Yeah.
We are almost out of time, but before asking the last question, I've got just a couple housekeeping matters to take care of. First of all, I'd like to remind you of our upcoming luncheon speakers. On April 9th, we have Dr. John Noseworthy, the President and CEO of the Mayo Clinic, who will discuss issues facing the healthcare industry. On April 12th, we have Ken Burns, documentary filmmaker. He will discuss his new documentary, The Central Park Five. And on April 17th, we have Gil Kurlikowski, the Director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy. Second, I would like to present our guest with the traditional National Press Club coffee mug.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And one last question. Someone in our audience asks, from where will the next Robert Johnson come? Who is most likely to be the next black media mogul?
Gee, that's a good question. That's really, The answer is, I do not know. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you all for coming today. I'd also like to thank the National Press Club staff, including its Journalism Institute and Broadcast Center, for helping organize today's event. Finally, here's a reminder that you can find more information about the National Press Club, including about becoming a member, on our website at www.press.org. Also, if you'd like to get a copy of today's program, you can find that there as well. Thank you. We are adjourned.
Best to create a business solution to help address these social and economic problems. For example, as Angela pointed out a year ago, the RLJ companies launched OpsPlace, an online job and business site specifically designed to introduce minority individuals and minority-owned businesses to large U.S. companies to encourage employment and business opportunities. The businesses I've started, in addition to creating a value for my investors and shareholders, have the important goal of empowering African Americans who have the ability to create value and wealth for themselves and ultimately this nation. Make no mistake, there are millions of African American men and women who have the talent, the ingenuity, and the work ethic to fulfill these goals. I think you would also agree with me that this nation has created the greatest society for individual economic opportunity and achievement that mankind has ever seen. But despite that fact, there is the troubling question that has to be asked, and that is, to what extent do African Americans fully participate in this equation? My primary concern is why, after enacting and enforcing needed civil and equal rights laws, spending more money on education for African American students at all levels than at any other time in the history of this nation, and having twice elected an African American president, Black American families are still experiencing a growing disparity in employment, access to capital, wealth accumulation, and as a direct consequence, stagnation in economic opportunity and quality of life. In an attempt to answer these questions, I commissioned a poll.
In his post-BET career, he's raising money as chairman of RLJ companies and investing in businesses in and out of media and entertainment. RLJ's portfolio is too long to list here in an introduction, but it includes real estate, private equity, car dealerships, and the video lottery industry. A year ago, RLJ announced it was acquiring two content companies, Image Entertainment and Acorn Media Group, to create an online distributor of digital video content. In February, the company launched the opsplace.com website to match minority job seekers with employers and minority business owners with applicants. Mr. Johnson said a chief reason he created the site was to reduce the disparity in unemployment for minority Americans. Mr. Johnson, a father of two, is known for his 15-hour workdays and 6-day work weeks. He's a native of Hickory, Mississippi, and grew up along with his 9 siblings in Freeport, Illinois. His early work included delivering newspapers, but he's since said it was something that required him to get up way too early to do. After college at the University of Illinois and grad school at Princeton University, he found his way to Washington and to a series of jobs, including as a lobbyist at what was then called the National Cable Television Association. That's what sparked his interest in creating his own cable network. Mr. Johnson is here today to announce the findings from a Zogby poll he commissioned on Black opinions in the age of Obama. Zogby Analytics surveyed about 1,000 African American adults online and by telephone to gauge the community's sentiments on politics, the economy, and social mores. Please help me give a warm National Press Club welcome to Robert Johnson.
Thanks, Angela, and good afternoon, everybody, and I'm delighted to be here. I was sitting here talking to Donna, and she said, you know you arrived when your face is on a cookie. So I'm glad it's her. And April Ryan told me she's
Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Angela Greiling-Keene. I'm a reporter for Bloomberg News, and I'm the 106th president of the National Press Club. We are the world's leading professional organization for journalists, committed to our profession's future through programming with events such as this, while fostering a free press worldwide. For more information about the National Press Club, please visit our website at www.press.org. To donate to programs offered to the public through the National Press Club Journalism Institute, please visit www.press.org/institute. On behalf of our members worldwide, I'd like to welcome our speaker and those of you in the audience at today's event. Our head table includes guests of our speaker as well as working journalists who are club members. If you hear applause from the audience, we'd note that members of the general public are also attending, so it's not necessarily evidence of a lack of journalistic objectivity. I'd also like to welcome our C-SPAN and public radio audiences. Our luncheons are featured on our member-produced weekly podcast from the National Press Club, which is available on iTunes. You can follow the action today on Twitter using the hashtag NPCLunch. After our guest speech concludes, we'll have a question and answer session. I will ask as many questions as time permits. Now it's time to introduce our head table guests. I'd ask each of you to stand up briefly as your name is announced. From your right, Jamila Bey, the host of Sex, Politics, and Religion Hour on Voice of Russia Radio. Margaret McKenzie, the ASHA Information Officer. Eddie Brown, the chairman, CEO, and founder of Brown Capital Management. Nikki Schwab, Yeas and Nays columnist for the Washington Examiner. April Ryan, White House correspondent for American Urban Radio Network. Traci Blunt, the senior vice president for corporate communication and public affairs for the RLJ companies.
She's going to tweet it. She already did. I also like to recognize Allison Fitzgerald, the chairwoman of the Speakers Committee, and also Nairi Wright, the who put this speaking event together for me, so thank you very much. So again, Angela, thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you, members of the press club and invited guests, for being here this afternoon to hear the results of a national poll that I commissioned last month. The poll was conducted by Zogby Analytics. As many of you know, John Zogby has conducted and produced polls for over 30 years and is well respected for his record of accuracy, credibility, and reliability. The poll was conducted by a telephone and online survey with a random sample of 1,002 African American adults across the country to gauge their opinion on current social, economic, and political issues directly affecting the African American community. As most of you know, I have always been vocal about economic opportunity for African Americans. As the founder of BET and now the RLJ companies, which, as Angela pointed out, includes investments in RLJ Lodging Trust, a publicly traded $2.5 billion hotel REIT with over 147 hotels, some 20,000 rooms across the country, where I serve as executive chairman. RLJ McClarity, the largest minority-owned automobile dealership group in the country with over $1 billion in sales. RLJ Private Equity, a private equity firm in partnership with the Carlyle Group. And RLJ Entertainment, the largest independent distributor of entertainment content, which is traded on the NASDAQ. I am what you might call a serial entrepreneur. I get a vision about something that should be done, usually in an area where African Americans are economically underrepresented, and I try my...
Over the podium, Donna Lindwan-Leger, reporter for USA Today, the former president of the National Press Club and the Speakers Committee chair this year. Skipping over the speaker for a moment, Nairi Wright, senior vice president with the MSL Group and the Speakers Committee member who organized today's event. Thank you for that, Nairi. Ty Brown, who is a guest of the speaker. Jeff Ballou, deputy news editor with Al Jazeera Media Network and a member of the National Press Club Board of Governors. Askia Muhammad, the news director for WPFW-FM, and John Doyle, CEO of the Principal Network. Our guest today became the first black billionaire in the United States, the first African American to list a company on the New York Stock Exchange, and the first black majority owner of a professional sports team. Robert Johnson founded Black Entertainment Television, which he sold as BET Holdings Incorporated to Viacom in 2001 for about $3 billion. Mr. Johnson has made his fortune targeting a black urban audience, first at BET, the nation's first television network to provide entertainment, music, news, sports, and public affairs programming for an African American audience. After its 1980 debut, the company went public in 1991, with BET channels now reaching about 90% of all black households with cable. He sold BET to Viacom after taking it private, again, 7 years after its IPO. It's now part of the Viacom empire, which also includes Comedy Central, MTV, Nickelodeon, Spike, and much more. Mr. Johnson shook off critics over the years, including director Spike Lee, who complained that BET programming included too much sex and violence, by pointing out that the E in the network's name stands for entertainment. Mr. Johnson is the former majority owner of the expansion NBA franchise, the Charlotte Bobcats. He sold his stake to NBA legend Michael Jordan 3 years ago.